The 2003 remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was a solid success for Michael Bay's production company Platinum Dunes, leading them to bring many more horror remakes to life through the 2000s. After the Amityville horror remake in 2005, Platinum Dunes decided to make another Texas Chainsaw Massacre film, but decided that instead of doing a sequel to the remake, they would do a prequel that explained how the Hewitt family came to be. Can't say I blame them for that decision. A pancake Arlie, Ermey, and crippled Leatherface wouldn't exactly make for the most tense slasher movie. It would be pretty fun though. Good evening. My name's Evan and welcome to Rocklin Graves. So this was an interesting movie to revisit because, and don't ask me how this happened because I truly do not remember, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning was the first slasher movie that I ever saw, and it had been a long time since I'd gone back and given it another watch. Scott Kozer, the writer of the 2003 film, was approached to return to write the prequel, but he was busy working on other projects at the time, so Platinum Dunes reached out to Sheldon Turner, who agreed to write the screenplay. Marcus Nispel also opted not to return for the prequel, and it was instead directed by Jonathan Liebsman, who had directed a short film in 2005 called Rings, which essentially acted as a bridge between The Ring and The Ring 2 and was very well received. With all of the familial cast from the remake returning to reprise their roles, the film is set 4 years prior to the events of that film and aims to fill in some blanks. Now, we may be able to preemptively answer the question of how well this movie actually does at that job, considering no one really talks about this movie anymore, but hey, maybe it's one of those underrated gems that got overlooked in the sea of remakes that was coming out. Maybe that's what happened. Let's see. Before that though, I want to thank my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members. These videos take a lot of time and energy to make, and the extra support really helps to keep things moving. If you're interested in getting some bonus material and accessing private supporter-only polls or getting early access to the big videos, consider supporting me on either platform.
You really think you're something in that outfit, don't you? Here's your pants. Supper's on the table.
So remember all those years ago when I was saying that maybe the reason this movie doesn't really get talked about much is because it came out in a really congested time for these remakes? Well, let's morph those phonetics a little bit and twist them until they sound more like it's because this prequel doesn't actually answer any of the interesting questions about the backstory and instead fills in the most unnecessary blanks that literally no one was wondering about. That would be a more accurate description. Now, I'm not generally a fan of prequels because they too often demystify things that were left intentionally vague in the source material as a storytelling device, and revealing some of that information can take away from the overall narrative. However, if we're gonna do a prequel to the Texas Chainsaw remake, the things that I think would make sense to explore would be how this family became the way they are. What brought them to this point of turning cannibalistic and lording over the area like a dark cloud? Now, to be fair, this movie does answer those questions, but it does so in a way that's about as satisfying as Platinum Dunes just tweeting the backstory. The things about their history that are actually interesting are revealed in random lines of dialogue, while they waste actual valuable screen time letting you know that this is how Monty lost his legs. This seems backwards to me. A prequel should add context to the narrative, not just extra lines to the description. This strange misfocus shows itself in the opening scene of the movie, which is set in 1939 and does what fans of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre have been waiting for since 1974. A woman falls unconscious while working in a meat factory and starts pissing steaming juices before the deformed Leatherface is born and promptly thrown in the garbage. Great, yes, thanks for clearing that up. That was really bothering me. The circumstances that lead to Luda May taking Thomas Hewitt into the family weren't exactly something that was keeping me up at night, and it's an odd way to start the movie out. There's a time jump following that introduction where the slaughterhouse is closing down and Thomas is being forced to leave, but when you've got a passion for something, you've gotta chase it. So, as any good motivational speaker would say, murder the people telling you to leave the slaughterhouse.
You gotta get the hell out of here, you dumb animal!
As he was in the remake, Leatherface is a much more confident killer here, and while I'm still disappointed that these movies made him less unique than he was in the original, I think it annoys me less in this movie than it did in the remake since it's basically dumbed down in most aspects. Keyword there is most. There are a few ideas in the narrative side of things that I actually think could have been really great, and on top of that, there's a lot more thought put into certain creative decisions than I ever expected or even really picked up on, and they tie in quite nicely with the thematic side of the story. We've got some things getting explained with regards to the Hewitt family, but of course we also need a group of youths for them to torment along the way, otherwise this would just be a really weird family drama. Well, they're really not well developed and aren't a whole lot more than your standard slasher fodder after a point. The premise set up with these youngsters is actually really damn cool, and their backstory is tied into Sheriff Hoyt's in an interesting way. Not 5 youths this time around, but instead 4, and the thing that saves them from being the most bland bullshit you can possibly imagine is Eric and Dean, 2 brothers who are on the way to fight in the Vietnam War after getting drafted. Eric's been over once before, but this is Dean's first time going, but after seeing the effects that the war had on Eric, Dean is planning to dodge his draft and go to Mexico with his girlfriend Bailey. At the start of the movie, Eric isn't aware of this, so there's some solid tension built up as he talks about having Dean by his side with him and not being worried while Dean awkwardly tries to play it off.
Dean's gonna be right there with me. Right, Dino? Ooh-ah.
What makes this such a great addition isn't just the layers it adds to the characters or the social commentary, which is something that was a huge part of the original film and has been tried a few times since but never really worked all that well. The thing that ties this whole situation together is that Sheriff Hoyt has also been to war, and when he discovers the burned draft card after a car accident turned exploding cow, don't ask, it sets him right off. Dean, being the little bitch that he is, lets Eric borrow his identity to take the brunt of Hoyt's aggression, and that setup creates some genuinely great material to explore. You have some interesting social commentary about the draft and the ethics surrounding draft dodging, where it's this battle between wanting to live life on your terms and then the other side that sees their duty to their country is more important than that. Adding on to that, we then have Eric claiming the draft card and putting Dean in a really bad situation where he's already feeling guilty for flipping on his brother like that, but now because he was too afraid to say the card was his, he's having to watch his brother get tormented by Hoyt. And on top of that, there's the fact that it's pretty clear right off the bat that Hoyt knows Eric lied, and he's now torturing him in front of Dean to try and punish both of them, not only for what he sees as the cowardly act of draft dodging, but also allowing his brother to take the hurt for it. There is some really great multi-layered narrative work going on here that is such a big help in making this movie feel more interesting and giving it a stronger identity of its own than it otherwise could have had. It's really refreshing to not just have another group of young people going to party somewhere, but instead giving a more serious and thought-provoking setup that opens some cool doors. Another interesting thing that shows that the creatives behind this movie had some genuine inspiration while making it have to do with some more artsy sides of the filmmaking process. They went for a color palette of faded red, white, and blue to try and evoke the collapse of the American dream, with these young men being shipped off to war in a decayed town turned to cannibalism to enable them to stand their ground where they grew up. Did I pick up on that while watching the movie? Not at all, but it was really interesting to read about afterwards. The other thing that shows that there is actual passion here is that when the film opens, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna be throwing out some like film tech jargon here for a second, just bear with me. When the film opens, they're shooting in the standard 180-degree shutter angle, and basically what that means is that they're setting the shutter speed of the camera at 2 times the frame rate, which is the standard for general filming since it results in the most natural looking motion, at least when shooting at 24 FPS. Then later on, after the car crashes, they switch to a 90-degree shutter angle, which means that they set the shutter speed to 1.5 times the frame rate, and this results in a much more jittery, frenetic look to the cinematography, and they do that because they wanted the feel of the movie to get really frenetic, and this sort of thing is often employed to convey that feeling. I appreciate that attention to detail and those attempts to glue the technical side of the film in with the narrative, and that shows me that they weren't just coming into this with a cheap mindset, hoping to quickly get in and cash out on a success of the remake. And it's been fun to sit here and praise the movie's setup and creative decisions with their technical approach, but almost none of it actually works. I'm not saying they have to shove it down our throats, but in order for color theory to actually come across without needing to be told that it's being employed is if you go out of your way to show how it's being used. Saying that the color palette is meant to reflect the decay of the American dream is a cool idea, but this just looks exactly the way you'd expect it to. Kinda hard to make a movie set in Texas during the summer and not have the color palette show desaturated reds, whites, and blues, so it doesn't really come across as anything special. Then with the shutter angle thing, again, cool idea. Lots of movies do this. This is one that's used a lot, but Holy good God almighty, this movie sometimes feels like the world's most nauseating found footage flick because of the amount of camera movement in conjunction with the 90-degree shutter angle and the often very tight framing. It just gives me a headache. This doesn't feel like an amped up action horror scene to me. It feels like the cameraman drank 4 Monster Energy drinks before being told he was shooting handheld with a DSLR, and it looks absolutely terrible. There are a few moments in this movie where I just completely gave up on trying to follow what was happening because it was so visually incoherent. What I find interesting about all of this is that everything I've been going over the last few minutes, from the good setup with the brothers and tying it into Hoyt's backstory to the thought put into the color palette and the cinematography style, it all shows a lot of good intentions behind this remake, and there are lots of ingredients here that feel like they have real purpose, but in almost all cases, those great ideas are used in ways that directly worsen the actual experience of watching the movie. The interesting elements of Hoyt's backstory are revealed through dialogue when he's talking about how he turned to cannibalism when he was a prisoner of war and was doing anything to survive, which I think makes a lot of sense and fits his character, but it's frustrating to learn this through Hoyt just saying it because it feels like this goes against the entire point of doing a prequel in the first place. If the actual significant reveals are being delivered through dialogue, then it feels like those lines could have just been in the first movie, and they feel like a complete afterthought while valuable screen time is spent on things that don't add much of anything. So while I like Hoyt's backstory, the way it's revealed is annoying and feels wasted.
Now, I had to eat. Rations were scarce.
The brothers' backstory is another thing that feels like wasted potential, because while it's interesting early on and does result in a solid section of the movie where Hoyt knows that Eric lied, none of it has much bearing on how the events of the movie actually play out, which makes the inclusion of this plot point feel tacked on and then thrown away after it gets their characters in their respective positions. If Dean had been able to redeem himself and fight back against the family, or Eric had more of an opportunity to make use of his experience in war to combat Hoyt's, then these things would have felt like they had more weight, but as is, they're more afterthoughts than anything else. Now, Dean does sort of get to redeem himself. He charges at Leatherface at the end to try and save Chrissy, but he's killed off in what's admittedly a pretty damn cool way. But it feels like a waste of his character arc. When I started thinking about that in context with the cinematography having this good intention behind it, but feeling like it's executed terribly, I realized that this movie just feels like it's constantly at odds with itself from the start. All of its cool or unique ideas are thrown away in such strange ways that make their inclusion feel like ugly set dressing, while the story goes off in these awkward tangents, like having this biker dude take Chrissy to the house after she tells him that Hoyt killed his friend. At first, it seems like this could lead to some interesting developments, but no, he gets killed pretty quickly, and the whole thing was entirely inconsequential and only serves to add another body to the count when the movie should have instead been focusing on making use of some of the cool elements in the setup. So is this a good movie that's muddled by not properly focusing on the best elements? No, this is an irritating movie that's made frustrating by wasting good ideas and falling back onto the most generic slasher movie tropes imaginable, with shallow characters and really dumb decision making, all wrapped up in a package that often feels and looks like a shitty made-for-TV movie. The cool elements feel like afterthoughts and have little or no impact on the actual events of the story, and by the end, you can almost entirely disregard any themes of the decay of the American dream or any social commentary about wars and drafting. There's some promise, and then it devolves into standard formulaic bullshit. I think the moment where it really hit me that this wasn't actually going to take advantage of any of the potential is the dinner scene where Sheriff Hoyt first decides that the family is going to turn to eating people for sustenance. For context, Sheriff Hoyt isn't actually a sheriff. His real name's Charlie, and he was called on by the sheriff after Leatherface killed the man in the slaughterhouse, and the sheriff asked Charlie to come along for the arrest to make sure it went as smoothly as possible.
You raised that retard right. Me and you, we ain't taking this drive right now. You can't have a creature like that around normal folk. That's what I'm saying.
That is the most compassionate sounding hate speech I have ever heard. Anyway, he kills the sheriff and decides that's about the best damn job interview anyone's ever done, so he takes the badge and the name and decides that the whole family is going to start eating people now because their town is falling apart. For the love of God, it's so frustrating to see how this backstory is glossed over so quickly and doesn't actually answer the question of why this happens. Hoyt just comes in with a bowl of person and goes, "This is what we're eating now," and they're like, I mean, let me think. Yeah, no, that's fine. Now, I'm not sitting here saying that a prequel needs to demystify everything and explain all the little details. I'm usually not a fan of prequels for that exact reason, but if you're gonna bother doing one, then why the hell are we skipping out on the one thing that actually makes sense to explore in a prequel to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? If the answer is just, oh, they're crazy, then why the fuck are we even making a prequel? We knew that in the first one. The story of Hoyt from the war is interesting, but that doesn't explain why Luda May and Monty are just down to munch some guy's stew. We don't actually learn much of anything about the family at all beyond some of Hoyt's history and Monty being legless in the first movie because of Leatherface's play surgery spearheaded by Hoyt.
Tommy, that's goddamn sloppy. That'll get infected. Even him up.
It sort of feels like the only reason this is a prequel at all is because they backed themselves into a corner with how the remake ended and didn't want to make a movie without Sheriff Hoyt and a one-armed Leatherface. Yeah, since I mentioned it in the last video, I'll also bring up that the music here is the same boring, generic horror movie orchestra that was in the remake, and it's just as bland here as it was there. I've been focusing almost entirely on the super messy and unfocused narrative elements of this movie, which I think are either huge wastes of potential or just inherently bad, but is it at least a solid slasher movie? Yes, it is. It doesn't have anything all that special, but if you just want to watch a brutal movie with Leatherface and co. killing people in really messed up ways, then there's definitely some fun to be had here. Leatherface himself is a hulking bad guy capable of dishing out some gnarly kills, and Arlie Ermey as Hoyt is once again great and brings that fun sadistic touch to the character.
Mama, you get over there and hold on Commandi.
Why?
Because he ain't gonna like this much, that's why.
The kills themselves are decent, although I think the camera work makes it harder to actually tell what exactly is happening at times, so sometimes it doesn't feel quite as impactful as it might have looked on set. But yeah, if all you're looking for is a gross and grimy slasher, you'll probably enjoy yourself with this movie. I can enjoy it on that level. There's nothing wrong with that. Since this is a prequel, all of the characters get killed off by the end. Even the one we think is going to be the final girl winds up getting a chainsaw through the belly when Leatherface snuck into the back of her car at some point, I guess. And then the movie ends with Leatherface walking back home in a shot that I actually really like, while we get another John Larroquette narration that feels a little more out of necessity at this point than it does to actually service the movie, but it's still cool to hear his voice. This shot right here at the end is foreshadowed earlier on in the movie, and I really like both of these images. Like, unironically, I think these are great. We're talking about like gritty slashers, super vibey. This isn't the worst movie of the franchise, but it's also a pretty low bar because there is some absolute dreck waiting for you in a marathon. Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Beginning is a serviceable slasher movie that should satisfy gorehounds, but it's such a fucking mess from a narrative standpoint, feeling like it just can't find what to focus on and instead throws a bunch of shit around with nothing landing anywhere particularly interesting. At times, the visuals just annoy me because of how shaky and tight the framing is, which is apparently supposed to make it feel frenetic, but it's honestly more frustrating than anything else to me. There are some cool ideas, but that's really all they are, and all of the reasons that exist to make a prequel to the Texas Chainsaw remake are thrown aside and don't go anywhere. It's pretty bad, and while I'm not in love with the remake, I would take that over this unfocused mess most days, unless I'm looking for just like low power mode, brain damage slasher movie to watch. This could fit very well. Nostalgia is only worth so much, and it wasn't anywhere near enough to save this one. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.